Hi, and welcome to VFX Tutors. I'm Josh, and in this tutorial I'm going to go through how to track, blur, and rolling shutter. These two things are quite common with each other, so if you've got quite blurry shots, and depending on what camera you're using, you're probably going to have a lot of rolling shutter. So I've got 3DE open. I've already set it all up for it to go. I won't go through and loading all the image sequences again because you've got plenty of videos on that. We just want to get into the tracking, so as you can see up here, I've just loaded in my image sequence. I've used my 50mm lens grid to understort. And I've set up my lens. So you can just, if you want to follow through, you can just fill in all these details. So I've got 3.6, 2.0, 250, 50mm. And I've got my lens grid distortion parameters here. And the only difference I've done here is I've got a fixed camera constraint. So that basically means that there's no parallax in the shot. So if we just go to f2, and if we look at this sort of light, this bokeh of the light and the stick, you can kind of tell there's no parallax. So we're going to lock it off as a nodal. And that's probably, when you've got really blurry shots, there's a high chance that your shots will be straight off a tripod rotating, because it's very difficult to get translation movement and very fast blur. So unless they're running with the camera on their shoulder. But for this instance, we're just going to treat it as a nodal camera. And we're just going to give how we can sort of track this stuff, because there's some really important stuff you have to keep an eye out for. So the reason why I've chose this, if we look through, it's very short. These two sticks are sort of almost pointing upwards. But we can see with the rolling shutter, because we've got the blur, and a sort of, if you don't understand how rolling shutter works, imagine how every image is taken with, the image is processed from top to bottom. So if it's fast moving, this is going to get processed first. But if it's moving fast, by the time the image is captured from down here, it's going to be slightly moved forward. So that's why you get the rolling shutter sort of jello effect. And you can sort of see it here, where it's wobbling left and right. And you'll get this with small sensors. You'll probably get it a lot with camera phones. This is kind of, I've gone to the extremes so I can kind of show you it a bit better. Yeah, so let's just go. It's all set up, so if you want to follow through or just watch this, you can. It's but all the details are here. You can just copy from here. So, say if you got this shot, you got some fairly easy tracking points, and you can just make a tracking point, gauge marker, track, and of course, it's not gonna track. And you can keep adjusting. So do that. Gauge marker and track. Still not going to track. You can even make it bigger, so search area is bigger. And you can keep doing that. Ooh. But you're going to get to a point where it's kind of, well, it actually worked there. So we'll set the 2D and have a look at that. And you can see, if we look here, we've got this point here. So it's actually worked fairly reasonably well. But as you can see here, you might be tempted to follow this point, but you actually want to keep to the center of the blur at all times. So if you've got something really blurry, it's good to make your tracking box an equal amount all the way around, because then you can use that to measure the center of the blur. And as you can sort of see, this is filling out the box fairly evenly on either side. And you can see the sort of marker here where it's filling out quite nicely. And it's always keeping into the center of the blur, and that's the key thing that you want to do. So that actually wasn't supposed to track very well, but it tracked alright. So let's do a manual one. So now let's pretend that this didn't work. So I'd go through, just don't center that for now. And I'd look at the points and say if it wasn't tracking, because we're going to do a manual one now. I'm going to center 2D. I'm going to put it on that, and I'm going to make sure that I'm a relatively even space either side, because this is what's going to help me sort of guess the center of the blur. And being able to find that center of the blur is the most important part, and also the most difficult part. So I'm going to go through my keyframes. And I can go frame by frame, but it's really not a good idea. You want to go through each of your keyframes to find. Imagine this like when you're doing the rotomation and you're figuring out your key poses. What we're going to do here is find positions where we have least blur. So that's probably a next least blur. And I'm going to use page up and page down to flick between the two. And I want to make sure that these are as close to perfect. It's slightly blurry, but it's not very much. I'm going to scrub through. I'll find the next one that's not so blurry, so I think it's the last frame, which is probably quite close, but it is blurry, that's the problem. So, see how we've got some blur here? And it's extended, so you might be tempted to go, oh, that's the center of the black dot, so it's there. But, yeah, it's working with the dot, but if you look at the blur, we're now pushing more to the right. See how the blur is now filling more of this frame? Where in previous ones, on the first and second frame we've done, it stays even. But now we've stayed in the center of the dot, and this is the reason why I've done this, because the dot, you can see it quite clearly, and you might be tempted to just track it to the center of the dot, which then it would be wrong. You'd have problems and you might get stuck and you won't understand where it's going wrong. But the problem here is we can see all our blur is shifting to the right. So we actually need to, let's try that there. So now we've got an even space, almost. We'll use the nudge tool to push it right a little bit. It's very hard to get it absolutely perfect, but we can get it. And you can see how the blur is now, it's fairly even either side. Even though this looks like it's slipping, but we're counteracting for the blur. So now we've got our keyframe set up. We can now go through frame by frame. So I'm just going to make sure my blur is always on the center. So I'm just using my nudge tools, which is my number pad. And I'm just trying to make sure that this is even though it's not matching the next frame. The amounts are the same. And I'm also going to check, use my page up and page down to check between these frames. So you want to do one frame, then check between. So this frame needs to match with this frame and that. So that ensures consistency going throughout. So you don't, because it's quite easy to track all the way through. Then by the time you get to the end, it's not matching. You'll have a big jump. So this sort of way to sort of make keys to check that your track's staying on point is a really good sort of method. So just going to continue going through, making sure that this is even all the way throughout. I'm using my number pad to adjust. Obviously this is not the most complicated blur shot, but this is the method that you'll use. This is pretty much the best way to do it. And this is what you'll do for it anyway, but I just don't want to be going through a huge blurry shot and spending like 3 days on it. With this, it's quite a short frame range, but we can achieve quite a lot. just from doing this frame range and understanding rolling shutter and blur, you'll be able to tackle those harder shots much easier. So I'm just checking between this frame. And you see how it's kind of pushing. The things you've got to keep an eye out is, you see how it's pushing more off to the left now than the right? That means we kind of need to push it more left, because we want to get this to expand evenly. So I'm using the edges as, I'm not changing this, because this is going to be, the tracking box is one of my most useful things for this, because I can use this to measure how much it's sort of spreading either side. And I'm just using my left and right buttons to flick through them. And you see how it's, the left side's tucking in much more than this. It means we need to go right. And we're effectively just matching the amount of squeeze and keeping it level all the way through. Even though we can sort of see parts which may throw us off, you just have to trust in keeping to the center of the blur, which is practically it for tracking blurry shots. It's just always staying in the center. But here we're sort of using our tracking box as a guide, and hopefully this should give you a really good sort of start with tracking blurry footage. Because a lot of the time it won't track nicely like that first one. You'll end up doing this. So you can see how it's nice and even on the inside. And if it's going up and down, you do the same and diagonally. You're just using the tracking box as a reference. And it can be very difficult to get the exact center. So shots like this, I've always said that, like, your deviation is just a guide. You can have high deviations but good solves. And this is going to be probably a good example of that, because we can go through and just refine this as much as we can, but we're never going to have, well, we never say never, right? But it would take a very long time to get an amazing deviation, so don't worry too much about that. What we're focusing on is getting it working, which is most of the case with blur, because the good thing about blur is it's used to hide a lot of things. So, but we want to try and get it as tight as possible. So you can we've got some skewing here from the rolling shutter, so it makes it more difficult. So we're just gonna make sure we check between all our frames. Just making sure that these sides are squeezing in as consistently as possible. And when you've got blurry shots, probably your biggest problem is going to be the rolling shutter. Unless you've got, I've had to shoot this on a different camera because my camera's got a specific global shutter, so you actually don't ever get rolling shutter. So I have to shoot this on my DSLR. And this is probably what most people are going to be filming stuff on, and their camera phones, and yeah, pretty much everything will have rolling shutter if you're moving fast. So we come to the same point here where you would think, let's put it on that dot, but we're not in the center. So you have to trust that keeping in the center is the right thing to do. We want to make sure this evenly expands throughout the frame, even though that looks like it's slipping. Cool. So now we've done our first sort of manual track. If we look at it, we can see it's working quite nicely. So let's do a couple more. Because we're on a fixed constraint, we only need a minimum of 3 tracks as well. But we will track all 6 of these, because with rolling shutter, you still need a good spread of tracks for it to calculate the offset for the rolling shutter. So I'm just going to pick the center of here. I'm going to adjust my tracking box so it's nicely even. You can even, I didn't rotate on the other ones, but you can sort of get it nice and square to it. And hopefully that'll help. I'm just going to go through, then I'm going to find my next clear one, my clear point. Then I use my page up and page down to make sure it's reasonably center. There is a slight amount of blur on here, so make sure it's the center. You can see how that can be confusing, that you might want to track this, but you can just about see the blur in here. So hopefully this will give you a good idea of how to track the blurry footage. Then I'm just going to go through and do the same thing. Just using my number pad to go through each of the keyframes. Unless you kind of, you've always got to try and, that's why you might not always, it's always very hard to guess where the center is, but we can sort of refine that near the end, because our deviation will show us where we're possibly slightly off. So that nicely fits in there. And the most important thing is to try and stay consistent. Although it can be quite difficult to sort of determine where the center is, it just takes practice. And hopefully it should help you with, like, it's quite difficult to, you very, very rarely come across very blurry footage, because it's not that nice, but you will come across it at some point. It's unavoidable. You'll have it turn up on your job list and it'll be super blurry footage and you'll be like, ugh. But hopefully this should help. I'll just try and keep that center. Cool. See how it looks like it's slipping off, but this is where it's tracking blur. It can be very confusing because you just think that's slipping off, but it's actually not. It's just a blur. Cool. So let's just carry on through these. I'm just going to do the same thing over. That's not the most interesting of shots, but hopefully it will give you a really good idea on how to tackle your own shots. I'm just going to go through. I'm just going to make sure all my first keyframes are sort of really nice. go through and do the rest. So I don't think it's not going to be a super long tutorial, so just be quite quick, but it'll give you a good idea of good 2D tracking techniques. And all I'm using is my arrows and my number pad to nudge it in, and my mouse to sort of get it roughly in the right place. You can see the sort of rolling shutter effect here. Does some quite awful stuff to your footage. Cool. So you've now done those 4 points. Let's do these last ones down here. These are a little bit blurry throughout, so you're going to, in favour of tracking the point, I'm going to shape my box, because I can see how tempting it would be to go just like this, track that, but then you're going to be tracking all the blur wrong. And I'm actually going to, in fact, not do it in the center, but I'm going to make sure my box is adjusted around the edges nicely. Make sure that fits evenly throughout. You can see how that looks kind of funny. So I'm just going to use page up and page down to check for my keyframes to make sure that the blur is even on both sides. I'm just going to go through and do the same thing. Just make sure my blur is aligned correctly. And once we've done this, we'll try a little solve and see what our deviation is doing. And I can probably tell you that it's not going to look very good, but we'll fix that. So I'm just going to quickly go through these. I think you've probably got a good idea of how I sort of track blurry footage, so I'm just going to try and get through these as fast as possible so we can get to sort of how to fix the errors that are going to come up. So, like with all this, I'm just trying to keep them as even on blur in the center and even on both sides of the tracking box. And I always use these as guides. So sometimes you'll be able to keep it inside this box, and sometimes you can use this box because you can see it's sort of almost fitting in here. So as long as you don't change this tracking box, you can use it as a guide. So don't ever change the size of it, because the tracking box is going to be your best sort of tool to make sure you keep it in the center. So I'm just using this as a sort of a ruler or an edge guide. You can sort of see we've got the same space on the outside. Cool. So, pretty much almost done. That's almost in the right place. So just do this one last one. I think that slightly goes up there. So it's always good to be check all your 2D points are super good. Put that marker there. Just gonna measure the outside. Obviously you're not gonna have like, you may not have this situation where you're tracking nice cylindrical shapes, but you can change the tracking mark to any sort of size and scale you want to sort of fit. So use that to your advantage to be able to use this as a guide, because you're not always going to be. I probably could almost just track these, but it's not really teaching you anything. So. I'm going to go for my keyframes and just check that they're all even, and I'll just go through and start plotting them out evenly. Got more coming out on the right side than the left. No, I'm just keeping it center all the way out throughout. See how it's now starting to meet the outside of this tracking box. Start using that as a sort of measurement. Cool, so we've now done that, so we can try and solve it. So don't forget, my camera constraint is on fixed camera position. So now if I press Alt-C, and this is what it'll look like when you're in a fixed camera position. It will lock off the translations and give you a nodal shot. And if we zoom out, we can see that our points are there. So if we use result, and we can see, let's show point deviation curves and active points. And we've got some crazy stuff going on in our deviation browser. So, like I say, always say that the deviation browser is just like almost a map to tell you what's going on. So we start, the first frame of footage is here. And if you look at it, It's ramping up, and if we can see our footage now, all our footage is sort of slanted and wobbly, so then the deviation browser goes down as the blur goes down, and the rolling shutter sort of isn't as affected as much. Then it goes up again, and you can see the rolling shutter here and the blur. And then you can see it here as well, and starting up. So you can see if you're having stuff like in your deviation browser like this, it's possibly that you have a rolling shutter issue. So this is why this is kind of not. It's just a map basically. So it shows you where your errors, what's kind of going wrong in the shot, but this is no more than a map basically to help you sort of fix those things. So to fix that, what we can do is go down to our rolling shutter compensation here, and you should get frame-wise time shift and constant distance. So we're going to leave the constant distance as 100 centimeters, turn on our rolling shutter enabled, and select adjust. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my Windows parameter adjustment window, and you can see I have my blur rolling shutter on here, and we can put it on adaptive and select adjust. And you can see now that our transfers best parameters into 1.18, which is actually given us a pretty good result. It's better than I thought it would be. We'll transfer the parameters. Let's do it one more time, see if it improves it. And let's see what that's done. Let's press Alt-C. And you can see now that's actually flattened out our deviation quite a lot. We've got some spikes here, which we can probably address. So now if we press F5, oh sorry, F5, yeah. We can sort of see, center our points. We got some still some strange stuff going on here. We can't really see what's going on. Our footage is wobbly. So if we go to our view, remove rolling shutter, and now this will remove the rolling shutter from the footage. So now if we just full frame this, in fact, let's full frame it. Zoom out. We can now see if we look down here, the bottom left, our shot's now being compensated in the distortion to keep our posts upright. So now that's completely removed our rolling shutter. And to help us as well, we can go to View, Show Rolling Shutter Time Shift. And what that'll do, you see, it will just add these little lines, and it will readdress our tracking points. So if you can see we've got our tracking points here, but it's adjusted everything for it. And now our footage is remove the rolling shutter. These were never perfectly upright, so I imagine that's probably fine. But it's mostly, let's focus on this bottom left, because this is what you're going to get with a lot of blurry footage. So I'm going to try and tackle two things in one tutorial: how to track blurry footage and rolling shutter. Cool. So let's go back to F2. Let's have a look at these spikes. And because we've got deviation browser, show point deviation curves active on, we can now select these points. And let's center 2D. Let's just have a look. And this is where we can start to refine some of our points. So we can actually see we've got less space, we've got more space on the right, so we actually need to go a little bit left. And you only need a tiny adjustment. So now press Alt-C. See how that's lowered the deviation now? So you only need a tiny amount. And we probably want to We'll do this for the other ones. We can definitely see that there's more on this side than that side, so I don't know. I think this is the one. This is the one that I auto-tracked at the start. So this is the one that's actually causing the problems. So maybe even tracking just using it when it worked, it didn't work very well because we can actually. I actually forgot that we tracked that like that from the start. So we can actually see the spacing is not correct. So we might actually have to go through and adjust all of these keys, because even so, that's not right. So that's what you got to be careful about. If it might be tracking well, but it's actually not. So, and you noticed all our other ones are not causing any problems. So just because it looks like it's tracking nicely doesn't mean it's actually tracking nicely. So as we can see here, it's way more to the right here. We're not even anywhere near the center. And there's only so much you can really see, but getting it as close as possible is your the main thing to do here. And we can see even these are all just the one that's sort of tracked without the one we didn't manual track is the one that's causing us problems. So now we can see we've got a much better deviation. We've got one spike here. So it looks like it's more to the right. So we'll see. Oh, that's made it worse, so maybe it's slightly. It's very hard to see sometimes, so we'll see again. Now we've reduced that. So we're gonna try and get this below 1. And I think if we get this below 1 for a blurry shot with a lot of rolling shutter, that's a pretty good shot. So now we get this other one. It's got a big peak here, kind of off at the start as well. So we're just using our deviation browser to find where our points may be slightly off. And I'm only going to go for the big peaks for now. I'm not going to try and do it all. I'm just going to get the large peaks. Before, I'm always going to do it every so often, so I'm not, because I could end up making it worse, which I did in that case. So I'm just going to, every time I adjust it, I'm just going to make sure I seem to be making this one worse. So I'm just using the edges to make sure. You only need to adjust it a tiny bit. After you adjust, just make sure you solve it to check. Seems to be. Yes. So if I turn on my rolling shutter time shift, I can sort of see where the 3D point is sort of trying to figure it out. It looks really confusing at the moment, so we saw our 3D point is sort of saying we're possibly a little bit too high. So I'm just trying to get this as close to the center as possible. As yeah, we've sort of got it pretty close. Let's turn those off, we don't really need those. And let's pick some other ones now. And let's turn off our time shift. And it only takes us a tiny amount to change the deviation quite a lot. So that's why I'm only going to go for the big peaks. Then solve every time I adjust, because you could be making it a lot worse. Because it's very, at this stage, it's very, very hard to sort of see what's going on. So I'm just using my nudge tool to sort of make sure it's center. And at this stage, it's just so difficult to really see. So we've got pretty good deviation. We've got 2 points here, which kind of seem to be not so great at the start. So let's try and fix that. So we've got more. And it only takes a tiny amount to sort of fix it. We're just trying to make this exactly the same amount on this side. So where's the other one? Cool. Cool, so let's try and fix that last one. That last one's bugging me. I'm just trying to get it as nice as possible. See, we're only moving it such a... You probably can't even see how much I'm moving it, but I'm only nudging it like 1 or 2 taps. Nothing more. So let's... And even just... Well, I think the nudge tool is automatically set at like 0.1 of 0.0.1 of a pixel, so it's incredibly hard to see, but you'll see it after a while. Let's fix this last one. Oh, we've made that worse, so sometimes it's good to zoom in and just double check that you're not. Cool. So I'm quite happy with that. Our deviation is pretty good for something with rolling shutter. We've got a big spike here. Let's actually try and see if we can get rid of that one. Sure. I reckon if we do that, we'll be able to get below 0.9. So let's go for that. Getting very close. We're just doing such small adjustments that you can barely even see it. So let's have a look at this one. This one sort of rises up quite a lot. Sometimes it is quite useful to see if you can't quite see it. Oh, I'm making it slowly making it worse. So what we can do, we turn on our view time shift. 3D distortion. Just use it as a guide. I feel like I've completely broken this one now, going worse. But that's why you need to always do small adjustments and check every time, because you don't want to end up. I'm going to remove that key actually. Just roughly guess it again. Progressively making this worse. So it might actually need to solve it again. There we go. Right. And it's just adjusting it too much. Sometimes you just only need to nudge it the smallest amount. And at the moment I'm just nudging it at one or two taps. Okay, so yeah, let's try and do our rolling shutter again. So we've got Windows, parameter adjustment window. Then let's just adjust again. Transfer parameters. Ooh, don't do that. Let's press Alt-C and solve. Yeah, and we're pretty much done. We've pressed. We can see that we've removed the rolling shutter. We've tracked our. I've shown you how to track blurry footage. Obviously, you may not get footage that's like this, but the principles are exactly the same. And yeah, we're pretty much done. You can export this out. It's exactly the same export as we've done before. I'm not going to go through how to export cameras and lens distortion nodes. I think we've done that quite a few times. So I just want to try and keep it to the main point. So yeah, we've tracked our footage. We've manually tracked our blur and removed the rolling shutter. When you export your Nuke LD node, it will bring all this in with you, so you don't have to worry about any of that. So yeah, cool. So if you enjoyed that tutorial, hit that like button and subscribe for more like this.